In the winter of 1857, 4 women vanished from a remote Mormon settlement in Utah Territory without leaving a single footprint in the snow. Their husband, Ezekiel Whitmore, claimed they had departed to visit family in the east, an impossible journey during the territory's most brutal winter on record. For over 60 years, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints kept the incident classified in their private archives, until construction workers building a new meeting house in 1920 made a discovery that would force church leaders to confront the darkest chapter in their early Utah history. What they found buried beneath the chapel's foundation would challenge everything the community believed about faith, family, and the price of building Zion in the wilderness. Before we continue with the story of Ezekiel Whitmore and the winter that changed everything, this channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to uncover the mysteries that history tried to bury. If you're ready to hear stories that will make you question what really happened in America's past, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? Are you brave enough to hear the truth about the early Mormon settlements? Let's find out together. The discovery in 1920 would prove that some secrets are too terrible to stay buried forever. The Utah Territory of 1847 was a land of impossible dreams and crushing realities. When Brigham Young first gazed upon the Salt Lake Valley and declared this is the place, he was looking at thousands of square miles of alkaline desert, bracketed by mountains that would trap his people in complete isolation for months at a time. Yet for the Mormon pioneers, this desolation was providence, a promised land where they could practice their faith without the persecution that had driven them from Missouri, Illinois, and every other place they'd tried to call home. Ezekiel Whitmore arrived in the valley during the second wave of Mormon migration in late September 1847. Unlike the advance company that had accompanied Brigham Young, Whitmore's group faced the approaching winter with insufficient supplies and inadequate shelter. He was 34 years old, a skilled carpenter from Vermont who had converted to Mormonism in 1843 after hearing Joseph Smith speak in Nauvoo. What set Whitmore apart from most of his fellow pioneers was his family situation. He traveled with 4 wives, all legally married to him under the principle of plural marriage that the church had begun practicing in secret. His first wife, Sarah Whitmore, was 31. A steady woman with graying hair who had been married to Ezekiel for 8 years. She was barren, a fact that in Mormon theology made plural marriage not just acceptable, but necessary for achieving the highest degree of celestial glory. Sarah had herself selected Rebecca Thornton, 27, as Ezekiel's second wife in 1845. Rebecca was educated, unusual for a woman of her time, and could read both English and German. She questioned church doctrine more openly than was comfortable for most Mormon men, but Ezekiel seemed to value her intellectual contributions to their family discussions. Mary Kellerman became the third wife in early 1847, just before the journey west. At 24, she was pregnant with her first child and suffered greatly during the trek across the plains. Her German immigrant parents had died during the Nauvoo period, leaving her with no family except the Whitmore household. The fourth wife, Ruth Caldwell, was barely 19 and had joined the family only 3 months before they departed for Utah. Her marriage to Ezekiel had been arranged by church elders who felt she needed protection after her own family died in the Missouri conflicts. The Whitmore family settled in what would later become known as Mill Creek, about 8 miles southeast of the main Salt Lake settlement. Ezekiel chose the location because a small creek provided water year-round, and the land showed promise for farming. More importantly, the isolation suited his temperament. He had always been a private man who preferred the company of his wives and his work to the social obligations of community life. That first autumn, Ezekiel worked with desperate intensity to prepare for winter. He built a large cabin with separate rooms for each wife, following the careful protocols that Mormon men had developed for managing plural households. The cabin was solidly constructed, with thick log walls and a stone foundation, but it was the only structure for miles in any direction. Their nearest neighbors were a family of Danish converts living 3 miles to the north, and even they would be unreachable once the snows began. The Mormon community in those early years was tight-knit by necessity. Every family's survival depended on cooperation, shared resources, and mutual support. Church leaders maintained strict oversight of plural marriages, not just for theological reasons, but because they understood the practical challenges of managing complex family relationships in isolation. Men who practiced plural marriage were expected to maintain harmony in their households and to contribute positively to the community's overall welfare. Ezekiel's wives each brought different skills to their remote household. Sarah managed the domestic affairs with quiet efficiency, organizing food storage and textile production for the winter ahead. Rebecca kept detailed records of their supplies and expenditures, and she had begun teaching herself basic medical skills that could prove essential in emergencies. Mary, despite her pregnancy, was skilled at preserving foods and had created an impressive store of dried fruits and vegetables. Ruth, the youngest, was energetic and optimistic, taking on the heaviest physical labor despite her small size. By December 1847, the Whitmore household appeared to be thriving. Church records show that Ezekiel made regular trips to the main settlement to trade goods and attend meetings. His wives were described by visitors as healthy, well-dressed, and remarkably harmonious for a plural family. Bishop William Curtis, who visited the cabin in early December, later wrote in his journal that the Whitmore family seemed blessed with unusual unity and prosperity, a testament to righteous living and proper order in the home. What Bishop Curtis didn't mention in his official journal, but confided to his private diary, was something that troubled him about the visit. The four women seemed almost too harmonious, finishing each other's sentences and moving in an eerily synchronized way that reminded him of a single mind inhabiting multiple bodies. He noted that they all bore similar marks on their wrists, small, deliberate cuts that they claimed came from kitchen accidents, but which all appeared to be the same age and depth. The winter of 1847-1848 was severe even by Utah standards. Snow began falling in mid-November and continued intermittently through March. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero multiple times, and the wind howled across the valley with such force that it could knock a grown man off his feet. For families living in the main settlement, the winter was challenging but manageable. For isolated families like the Whitmores, it was a test of preparation, faith, and endurance. The last confirmed sighting of all four Whitmore women together was on December 19, 1847, when a group of men from the main settlement passed by the cabin while hunting. They reported seeing smoke from the chimney and briefly spoke with Sarah and Rebecca, who appeared at the door to accept a gift of fresh deer meat. The women thanked them politely but declined an invitation to send someone back to the settlement for Christmas services, saying they planned to hold their own family worship. What happened next would puzzle investigators for decades and create the most persistent mystery in early Mormon Utah history. The first sign that something was wrong came on January 8, 1848, when Ezekiel Whitmore appeared at the main settlement asking to speak privately with Bishop Curtis. Those who saw him that day described a man who appeared to have aged years in just 3 weeks. His clothes were disheveled, his beard unkempt, and his eyes held what one witness called the look of a man who had seen too much. In the privacy of the bishop's cabin, Ezekiel explained that his wife Sarah had received a revelation directing her to travel east to care for her sick sister in Missouri. He said she had felt the calling so strongly that she couldn't wait for spring, and had departed with a small group of travelers who had passed through their area. Bishop Curtis was immediately suspicious. No travelers would attempt the eastward journey in the middle of winter, and Sarah had never mentioned having a sister in Missouri. When the bishop pressed for details, Ezekiel's story began to shift. First he said the travelers were missionaries returning east. Then he claimed they were mountain men who knew secret winter routes. His hands trembled as he spoke, and he kept glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to enter. Most disturbing was his insistence that the bishop shouldn't visit the cabin to check on the remaining wives, claiming they were observing a period of spiritual purification that required complete isolation. Bishop Curtis made notes of the conversation in his official journal, but his private diary reveals his growing alarm. He wrote, "Brother Whitmore speaks of revelations, but I fear he may be concealing something far more earthly and terrible. His manner suggests guilt rather than grief, and his explanations contradict both reason and the season. 3 weeks later, on January 30th, Ezekiel returned to the settlement with an even more disturbing report. Rebecca, he claimed, had also received a calling to travel east, this time to serve as a teacher in a mission school. She had departed with another group of travelers, taking only essential supplies. The bishop demanded to know what travelers could possibly be moving through Utah territory in February, and Ezekiel's response was rambling and incoherent, filled with references to God's mysterious ways and trials of faith. This time, Bishop Curtis insisted on visiting the cabin to speak with the remaining wives. Ezekiel became agitated, claiming that Mary and Ruth were too ill to receive visitors, suffering from a fever that could be contagious. He promised to bring them to the settlement as soon as they recovered, but the bishop's suspicions had grown too strong to ignore. On February 3rd, Bishop Curtis organized a group of 5 men to visit the Whitmore cabin. The journey through the snow-covered hills was treacherous, taking most of the day despite the relatively short distance. When they arrived at the cabin, they found Ezekiel alone, sitting by a fire that seemed insufficient to heat the large structure. He greeted them with nervous courtesy, but his explanations about his wives' whereabouts had changed again. Now he claimed that Mary and Ruth had both recovered from their illness and decided to join Sarah and Rebecca in the east. He said they had departed just 2 days earlier, traveling with a group of trappers who had promised to escort them safely to civilization. The bishop asked to see the women's personal belongings, and Ezekiel showed them several rooms that appeared to have been hastily cleared out. Clothing, books, and personal items were gone, but the bishop noticed that heavy items like furniture and cooking implements remained, unusual for women making a permanent departure. More troubling were the signs of recent digging behind the cabin. Ezekiel explained that he had been working on an expansion of the root cellar, preparing for the next winter. But the ground was frozen solid, and the amount of disturbed earth seemed far greater than necessary for a simple food storage area. When one of the men commented on the difficulty of digging in frozen ground, Ezekiel's response was sharp and defensive, claiming that God's work requires dedication even in the hardest conditions. The visiting party spent the night in the cabin, and several of them later reported feeling deeply unsettled by the experience. The building was too quiet, they said, with none of the subtle sounds that indicated the presence of women. No rustling of skirts, no soft conversations, no feminine touches in the daily routines. Ezekiel served them a meal that seemed to consist entirely of preserved foods, despite the fact that fresh bread and dairy products should have been available if women had been managing the household recently. Most disturbing was an incident that occurred during the night. Thomas Garrett, one of the visiting men, was awakened by what he described as the sound of weeping, faint but distinct, coming from somewhere beneath the cabin. When he mentioned this to the others in the morning, they dismissed it as wind or settling timber, but Garrett remained convinced that he had heard human voices in distress. The bishop's party departed the next morning with more questions than answers. In his private journal, Bishop Curtis wrote, "I fear that Brother Whitmore may have committed acts that will bring shame upon our people and our faith. The isolation of winter can drive men to desperate measures, and I worry that the pressures of plural marriage may have proven too great for his spirit to bear." However, the bishop faced a difficult decision. The Mormon community was already under scrutiny from the federal government, and rumors of violence or impropriety could bring unwanted attention from authorities. The principle of plural marriage itself was controversial, and any scandal involving a polygamous family could be used to justify government intervention in church affairs. After consulting with other church leaders, Bishop Curtis decided to continue monitoring the situation quietly, while hoping that the spring would bring some resolution to the mystery. Throughout the remaining winter months, Ezekiel made regular appearances at the settlement, always alone and increasingly gaunt. He claimed to be in regular correspondence with his wives, receiving letters that confirmed their safe arrival in the East and their happiness in their new circumstances. But he could never produce these letters, claiming they were too personal to share, or that he had accidentally destroyed them in the fire. Members of the community began to whisper among themselves. Some believed that Ezekiel had indeed sent his wives away, perhaps because he could no longer support them, or because the isolation had created unbearable tensions in the household. Others suspected something far more sinister, pointing to his erratic behavior and the inconsistencies in his stories. The truth would remain hidden until the spring thaw revealed secrets that would challenge everything the community thought they knew about faith, family, and the price of survival in the wilderness. When the snows melted in April 1848, Bishop Curtis finally had the opportunity to conduct a thorough investigation of the Whitmore property. What he discovered there would haunt him for the rest of his life and create a mystery that would persist for over 70 years. The cabin itself appeared to have been abandoned for weeks. A thick layer of dust covered the furniture, and the rooms that had supposedly belonged to the four wives showed signs of hasty cleaning rather than normal departure. More significantly, the bishop found several items that contradicted Ezekiel's claims about his wives' voluntary departure. Rebecca's most treasured possession, a leather-bound journal in which she had recorded her thoughts and observations since joining the family, was hidden beneath a loose floorboard in what had been her room. The final entry, dated December 20th, 1847, was written in a shaking hand and contained a single cryptic sentence. "E says we must all make the ultimate sacrifice for the sake of the eternal family, but I fear his revelations come from a darker source than heaven." Behind the cabin, the area that Ezekiel had claimed to be excavating for root cellar expansion told a different story. The disturbed earth covered a much larger area than necessary for food storage, and the digging appeared to have been done in stages over several weeks. Most disturbing was what the bishop found partially buried in the loosened soil: fragments of fabric that matched descriptions of clothing worn by the four wives, along with personal items including a wedding ring that Sarah had worn since her marriage to Ezekiel. The bishop also discovered evidence of what appeared to be some kind of ritual activity. In a cleared area near the digging site, he found the remains of multiple fires, arranged in a specific pattern that seemed deliberate rather than practical. Mixed with the ashes were burned fragments of paper that appeared to be pages from religious texts, though not from any standard Mormon publications. Some of the legible fragments contained references to blood atonement and eternal sealing through sacrifice, concepts that existed in Mormon theology but were being interpreted in ways that horrified the bishop. More evidence came from the cabin's interior. In the room that had belonged to Ezekiel and Sarah, the bishop found a hidden compartment containing several notebooks filled with Ezekiel's handwriting. The entries documented his growing obsession with what he called the principle of ultimate consecration, a belief that God required the faithful to surrender everything, including life itself, to achieve the highest degree of celestial glory. The notebooks revealed that Ezekiel had been studying obscure religious texts and had begun to believe that his family had been chosen for a special mission that would require extraordinary sacrifice. The final entries in these notebooks described Ezekiel's growing certainty that his wives had been sent to him specifically to fulfill this divine purpose. He wrote about receiving visions that showed him the eternal glory that awaited families who proved their absolute devotion through ultimate sacrifice. The handwriting became increasingly erratic as the entries progressed, and the later pages contained disturbing references to the willing offering of innocence and the sealing power of shed blood. Bishop Curtis faced an impossible situation. The evidence strongly suggested that Ezekiel had murdered his four wives, possibly as part of some twisted religious ritual. But Ezekiel himself had vanished completely, leaving no trace of his whereabouts or intentions. The bishop's attempts to track him proved fruitless. He had simply disappeared into the vast wilderness of the Western Territories, where a man could lose himself forever if he chose to do so. The church leadership made the difficult decision to classify the entire incident as confidential. They were acutely aware that any public revelation of the suspected murders would provide ammunition for anti-Mormon sentiment and could bring federal intervention that would threaten the survival of their entire community. The official records were sealed, and the few men who knew the truth were sworn to secrecy. The Whitmore cabin was quietly dismantled, and the disturbed earth behind it was carefully restored to its natural state. The church purchased the property and designated it as unsuitable for settlement, ensuring that no one would accidentally discover what might remain buried there. The four wives were officially listed as having relocated to the eastern states, and their disappearance was explained as a family decision to return to more settled areas. But secrets have a way of persisting, especially in small communities where every family's business is known to all their neighbors. Over the years, whispered stories began to circulate about the winter when four women vanished, and one man's faith led him to commit unspeakable acts. Some versions of the story claimed that Ezekiel had been driven insane by isolation and religious mania. Others suggested that he had discovered something in the isolated valley that had demanded a terrible price for his family's survival. The most persistent rumors centered on the idea that Ezekiel had not acted alone. Some believed that the four women had been willing participants in whatever ritual had cost them their lives, convinced by their husbands' claims of divine revelation that their sacrifice was necessary for eternal salvation. This version of the story was particularly disturbing because it suggested that the tragedy had been the result of shared delusion rather than individual madness. As the years passed, the area around the former Whitmore property developed a reputation for unusual occurrences. Travelers reported feeling watched when passing through the valley, and some claimed to hear women's voices carried on the wind, especially during the winter months. These reports were dismissed as superstition by church leaders, but they contributed to the sense that something dark and unresolved remained connected to the site. The mystery might have remained buried forever, if not for the church's continued growth and the need for new buildings to serve expanding congregations. In 1920, more than 70 years after the disappearances, church authorities decided to build a new meeting house in the rapidly growing Mill Creek area. The chosen site was selected for its central location and level ground, with no awareness of the dark history that lay beneath the surface. What the construction workers discovered would force the church to confront the truth about one of its most carefully hidden secrets, and would reveal that the winter of 1847-1848 had been even more terrible than anyone had imagined. The construction of the new Mill Creek Meeting House began on a crisp October morning in 1920. The project supervisor, Brother Samuel Morrison, was a devout Mormon who had been born in the valley and had heard whispered stories about the Whitmore property throughout his childhood. But like most members of his generation, he dismissed these tales as folklore that had grown in the telling over the decades. The construction crew began excavating the foundation on October 15th, working with steam-powered equipment that made quick work of the rocky soil. For the first 2 days, the work proceeded normally, with nothing more unusual than the occasional discovery of old horseshoes or pieces of rusted metal that marked the site's history as grazing land. On the third day, Brother Morrison's crew made their first disturbing discovery. About 4 feet below the surface, they uncovered what appeared to be a deliberately constructed stone chamber, roughly 8 feet square and lined with carefully fitted rocks. The chamber had been sealed with a flat stone cover, and when they lifted it, they found a collection of objects that seemed to have been placed there intentionally as some kind of burial cache. The objects included 4 sets of women's clothing, neatly folded and arranged in separate piles. Each set consisted of a dress, undergarments, shoes, and personal effects like combs, mirrors, and jewelry. Most significantly, each pile contained a small leather purse with identification papers and personal documents that clearly belonged to Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, and Ruth Whitmore. The preservation was remarkable, protected by the dry conditions and stone construction, and the items appeared to be in the same condition as when they were placed in the chamber. Brother Morrison immediately contacted Bishop Harold Stevenson, the current leader of the Mill Creek Ward. Bishop Stevenson was young and had no knowledge of the Whitmore incident, but he recognized the significance of the discovery and contacted church headquarters in Salt Lake City. Within hours, a team of church officials arrived at the construction site, led by Elder James Tanner, a member of the Quorum of the 12, who had access to the church's confidential historical archives. Elder Tanner's examination of the documents found in the stone chamber confirmed what the older church leaders had long suspected. The papers included letters written by each of the 4 wives, apparently composed shortly before their deaths, and intended as final messages to family members they would never see again. The letters were haunting in their acceptance of what they described as their calling to eternal glory through ultimate sacrifice. Sarah's letter, written in her characteristic careful script, expressed gratitude for her selection by divine providence to participate in the sealing ordinance that would bind our family together throughout eternity. Rebecca's letter was longer and more theologically complex, containing references to obscure doctrines and her belief that the shedding of innocent blood in righteousness would open the doors of celestial glory for all who participated in willing submission to God's will. Mary's letter was the most heartbreaking, filled with references to her unborn child and her faith that the sacrifice of 2 lives would count as double offering in the eyes of the Lord. Ruth's letter was the shortest, consisting mainly of expressions of love for her family and her excitement about joining the eternal family in the most sacred way possible. The letters made it clear that the 4 women had not been murdered against their will, but had participated willingly in what they believed to be a sacred ritual. This revelation was almost more disturbing than the alternative, suggesting that Ezekiel had successfully convinced his wives that their deaths were necessary for their eternal salvation. Elder Tanner immediately ordered the construction to be suspended and contacted the church's historical department to locate the sealed files related to the Whitmore incident. What they found in those files painted a more complete picture of the tragedy, but also raised new questions that would prove even more troubling. The sealed files contained Bishop Curtis's complete investigation notes, including details that had never been shared with other church officials. Among these was the bishop's discovery of additional evidence that suggested the Whitmore tragedy had not been an isolated incident. References in Ezekiel's notebooks mentioned correspondence with other Mormon men who had received similar revelations about the necessity of ultimate sacrifice for their families. Most disturbing was a letter that Bishop Curtis had intercepted in 1849, addressed to Ezekiel at a remote mining camp in Nevada Territory. The letter, signed only with the initials J.M., contained coded references to the completion of the work and expressed satisfaction that the sealing had been accomplished according to the pattern revealed to us. The letter also mentioned that the others who received the same calling had fulfilled their obligations with equal faith and devotion. This evidence suggested that Ezekiel had not acted alone, but had been part of some kind of secret group within the early Mormon community that had developed extreme interpretations of church doctrine. The group apparently believed that the ultimate expression of faith required the sacrifice of family members, and that such sacrifices would guarantee exaltation in the celestial kingdom. Elder Tanner's team began a careful review of early church records, looking for other unexplained disappearances or unusual incidents that might be connected to this secret group. What they found was a pattern of missing persons cases and unexplained family tragedies that had been scattered across the early Mormon settlements but had never been connected to each other. Between 1847 and 1855, at least 12 Mormon families had reported the disappearance of family members under circumstances similar to the Whitmore case. In each instance, the missing persons were reported to have departed for the East or received callings to serve missions in distant locations. In most cases, the reports were made by male family members who claimed to have received revelations directing them to allow their wives or children to leave for spiritual purposes. The pattern was subtle enough that it had never been detected by church authorities at the time, but viewed together, the cases suggested a coordinated effort by a secret group to carry out what they believed to be sacred killings. The victims were predominantly women and children, and the perpetrators were men who had been noted for their exceptional devotion to church doctrine and their leadership roles in their local communities. Most chilling was the discovery that several of the men involved in these disappearances had maintained correspondence with each other, sharing theological justifications for their actions and encouraging each other in their divine calling. The letters revealed that the group had developed an elaborate theological framework for their beliefs, drawing on obscure passages from Mormon scripture and early church teachings to justify their actions. The group apparently believed that the practice of plural marriage was only the beginning of a higher law that would ultimately require the sacrifice of family members to achieve complete consecration to God. They saw themselves as pioneers of a more advanced form of religious devotion that would eventually be revealed to all faithful Mormons as the ultimate requirement for celestial glory. As Elder Tanner's investigation continued, the scope of the conspiracy became increasingly clear. The secret group appeared to have included prominent church members from across the Utah Territory, including some who had held significant leadership positions. The group had operated with careful coordination, sharing information about their activities and providing mutual support for their beliefs. The investigation also revealed that the group had eventually been detected by church authorities in the mid-1850s, leading to a secret purge that had removed suspected members from leadership positions and forced others to flee the territory. The church's official records made no mention of these actions, which had been carried out quietly to avoid creating scandal or providing ammunition for anti-Mormon critics. But the discovery of the stone chamber at the Mill Creek construction site proved that the group's activities had been far more extensive than church leaders had realized at the time. The careful preservation of the victims' belongings suggested that the perpetrators had viewed their actions as sacred ordinances that required proper documentation and remembrance. The question that haunted Elder Tanner and his team was whether the group had been completely eliminated in the 1850s, or whether some members had escaped detection and continued their activities in remote areas of the Western Territories. The evidence suggested that the conspiracy had been larger and more organized than anyone had imagined, with implications that extended far beyond the tragic fate of the 4 Whitmore women. The investigation would soon reveal that the stone chamber was only the beginning of what lay buried beneath the Mill Creek construction site, and that the winter of 1847 to 1848 had been even more terrible than the darkest rumors had suggested. As Elder Tanner's team expanded their excavation of the Mill Creek site, they made increasingly disturbing discoveries that suggested the Whitmore tragedy was far more complex than a single family's descent into religious madness. The stone chamber containing the women's belongings was only the first layer of a carefully constructed burial site that had been designed to preserve evidence of what the perpetrators clearly viewed as sacred acts. Beneath the stone chamber, the excavation revealed a second level of construction, a larger underground space that had been carved directly into the bedrock and lined with carefully fitted stones. This chamber was approximately 12 feet square and 6 feet deep, with drainage channels that had kept it dry for over 70 years. The walls were covered with carved symbols that combined traditional Mormon imagery with elements that seemed to draw from other religious traditions. The most prominent symbol was a modified version of the Mormon temple square and compass, but surrounded by imagery that included Egyptian hieroglyphs, Masonic symbols, and what appeared to be representations of ancient sacrifice rituals. The carvings were sophisticated and deliberate, suggesting that whoever had created them possessed considerable knowledge of religious symbolism and had spent significant time planning the chamber's construction. In the center of the chamber, the team found what appeared to be a stone altar, roughly hewn from local granite and stained with what laboratory analysis would later confirm to be human blood. The altar was surrounded by 4 smaller stone platforms, each bearing carved inscriptions that included the names Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, and Ruth, along with dates corresponding to the winter months of 1847-1848. The inscriptions also included theological passages that had been carved in careful script, drawing from Mormon scripture, but interpreted in ways that justified the taking of human life for religious purposes. One passage, carved above the central altar, read, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends, and greater still is the love that lays down the lives of the beloved for the glory of God and the sealing of eternal families." But the most shocking discovery came when the team excavated beneath the stone platforms. Each platform concealed a carefully prepared burial site containing human remains that had been preserved through deliberate mummification techniques. The bodies of the 4 women had been prepared with materials and methods that suggested extensive knowledge of preservation practices, possibly derived from early Mormon interest in Egyptian culture and practices. The condition of the remains allowed for detailed examination that revealed the manner of death. Each woman had died from a single precise wound to the heart, inflicted with what appeared to be a ceremonial blade. The wounds were identical in location and depth, suggesting that the killings had been carried out with practiced skill and according to a predetermined ritual pattern. More disturbing was evidence that the women had been dressed in special ceremonial garments before their deaths, elaborate white robes that had been decorated with religious symbols and personal items that held spiritual significance. The garments appeared to have been specially prepared for the ritual, with careful attention to detail that suggested the perpetrators had viewed the killings as sacred ordinances requiring proper ceremonial preparation. The discovery of these ritual preparations forced Elder Tanner's team to confront the possibility that the Whitmore women had not only consented to their deaths, but had actively participated in elaborate religious ceremonies that they believed would guarantee their eternal salvation. The evidence suggested that the killings had been carried out over several weeks, with each death forming part of a larger ritual cycle that had been carefully planned and executed. Additional evidence found in the chamber included detailed records of the ritual proceedings, carved into stone tablets that had been placed in niches around the walls. These records provided a horrifying minute-by-minute account of the ceremonies, including the women's final words and their expressions of faith and gratitude for their selection for eternal glory. The tablets also contained references to the great work that was being carried out by the secret group and to the pattern revealed from on high that guided their actions. The records made it clear that the Whitmore killings were part of a larger plan that involved multiple families and was intended to demonstrate the ultimate degree of faith and devotion required for celestial glory. Most chilling was the discovery that the ritual chamber had been designed for repeated use. The drainage systems, preservation techniques, and careful construction suggested that the site had been intended to serve as a permanent location for similar ceremonies. The chamber contained preparation areas for multiple victims and storage spaces for ritual implements and ceremonial garments. The investigation team also found evidence that the chamber had indeed been used for additional victims beyond the 4 Whitmore women. Carved records indicated that at least 8 other individuals had been sealed in the chamber between 1848 and 1855, including members of 3 other families that had been reported missing during the early years of Mormon settlement in Utah. The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear. The secret group had operated for nearly a decade, carrying out ritual killings that they believed were necessary for achieving the highest degree of religious devotion. The group had developed elaborate theological justifications for their actions and had created permanent facilities for conducting their ceremonies. Elder Tanner's team faced a crisis that threatened to expose the darkest chapter in Mormon history. The evidence they had uncovered proved that a secret group within the early church had carried out systematic ritual murders, possibly involving dozens of victims over several years. The implications for the church's reputation and the faith of its members were staggering. The investigation also revealed that the group had maintained detailed records of their activities, including lists of potential victims and plans for expanding their operations. The records suggested that the conspiracy had been far more organized and extensive than anyone had imagined, with cells operating in multiple settlements across the Utah Territory. Most disturbing was evidence that some members of the secret group had held positions of authority within the church hierarchy, using their access to confidential information to identify potential victims and to cover up their crimes. The group had apparently used their knowledge of church doctrine and their positions of trust to convince victims that their deaths were necessary for eternal salvation. The investigation team realized that they were uncovering not just a series of isolated crimes, but evidence of a systematic conspiracy that had operated within the highest levels of the early Mormon church. The implications were so serious that Elder Tanner immediately contacted the church's first presidency to report his findings and to request guidance on how to proceed. The decision that would be made in the coming days would determine whether the truth about the Whitmore tragedy and the larger conspiracy would ever be revealed to the public, or whether it would be buried once again to protect the church from scandal and persecution. But as Elder Tanner's team continued their excavation, they began to suspect that the underground chamber held even more terrible secrets that would make the choice between truth and concealment even more difficult. The final phase of Elder Tanner's investigation began when his team discovered a hidden passage leading from the main ritual chamber to an even deeper level of construction. The passage was narrow and had been carefully concealed behind a false wall, suggesting that it led to the most secret part of the underground complex. What they found in this deeper chamber would reveal the true scope of the conspiracy and the identity of its leadership. The deeper chamber was smaller than the ritual space above, but it had been constructed with even greater care and attention to detail. The walls were lined with carefully fitted stones that had been carved with intricate religious symbols, and the ceiling was supported by precisely cut archways that demonstrated advanced engineering knowledge. This was clearly the inner sanctum of the secret group, the place where their most important meetings and ceremonies had been conducted. In the center of the chamber, the team found a stone table that had been carved with extraordinary precision. The table's surface was covered with detailed maps of the Utah Territory, showing the locations of Mormon settlements and marking specific sites that had been designated for the group's activities. The maps included detailed notes about the families living in each settlement, with particular attention to households that might provide suitable victims for their rituals. The most shocking discovery was a series of stone tablets that contained the complete theological framework developed by the secret group to justify their actions. These tablets revealed that the group had been led by a man named Jeremiah Blackwood, who claimed to have received direct revelations from Joseph Smith himself, directing him to establish what he called the Order of Eternal Sacrifice. According to the tablets, Blackwood had been present at some of Joseph Smith's private meetings in Nauvoo and had developed an extreme interpretation of the prophet's teachings about eternal families and celestial marriage. Blackwood believed that the ultimate test of faith required families to demonstrate their willingness to sacrifice everything, including life itself, to prove their devotion to God and to secure their eternal exaltation. The tablets contained detailed instructions for identifying suitable families for participation in the order's rituals. The criteria included strong faith, isolated living situations, and family structures that would not be immediately missed by the broader community. Polygamous families were particularly targeted because their complex relationships and frequent travel made disappearances easier to explain and conceal. Ezekiel Whitmore had been recruited into the order during the winter of 1846-1847, while the Mormon community was preparing for their exodus to the west. The tablets revealed that Blackwood had identified Ezekiel as an ideal candidate because of his deep religious convictions, his isolated temperament, and his plural marriage to 4 women who had no close family connections in the Mormon community. The recruitment process had been gradual and carefully orchestrated. Blackwood had begun by sharing what he claimed were secret revelations about the higher laws of celestial marriage, gradually introducing Ezekiel to increasingly extreme theological concepts. By the time the Whitmore family departed for Utah, Ezekiel had been fully indoctrinated into the order's beliefs and had committed to carrying out the ritual sacrifice of his wives during their first winter in the territory. The tablets also revealed that the order had established similar operations in multiple Mormon settlements across the West. Each cell was led by a trusted member who had been personally recruited by Blackwood, and who was responsible for identifying potential victims and carrying out the ritual killings. The cells operated independently, but maintained communication through a network of coded letters and secret meetings. The ritual chamber beneath the Mill Creek site had been one of several permanent facilities established by the Order for conducting their ceremonies. Similar chambers had been constructed near other Mormon settlements, each designed to preserve evidence of the rituals for what the Order believed would be the eventual recognition of their practices as legitimate religious ordinances. The tablets contained detailed accounts of the specific rituals that had been carried out in the Mill Creek chamber. The ceremonies had followed a precise pattern that had been developed by Blackwood, based on his interpretation of ancient sacrifice practices and early Mormon temple rituals. Each ceremony had lasted several days and had included elaborate preparations, theological instruction, and final rituals that the participants believed would seal their eternal families together in the highest degree of celestial glory. The account of the Whitmore family's final days was preserved in horrifying detail. The ritual had begun on December 20th, 1847, with Sarah's voluntary participation in a ceremony that she believed would ensure her family's eternal exaltation. Each of the other wives had participated in turn over the following weeks, with the final ceremony involving Ruth taking place on February 15th, 1848. The tablets described how each woman had spent her final days in prayer and preparation, convinced that her sacrifice would open the doors of celestial glory for her entire family. They had written letters to family members, prepared their burial garments, and participated in elaborate ceremonies that they believed were sacred ordinances revealed directly from God. Most disturbing was the revelation that the women had not only consented to their deaths, but had actively encouraged each other to participate in the rituals. The tablets contained their recorded conversations, showing how they had strengthened each other's faith and had expressed excitement about their calling to eternal glory through ultimate sacrifice. The investigation team also discovered evidence that the order had planned to expand their operations significantly. The tablets contained lists of dozens of additional families that had been targeted for recruitment, along with detailed plans for establishing new ritual sites across the Western Territories. The order had apparently believed that their practices would eventually be recognized as legitimate religious doctrine and would become a standard requirement for achieving the highest degrees of eternal glory. But the tablets also revealed why the order's activities had come to an end in the mid-1850s. Church authorities had begun to detect the pattern of disappearances and had launched a secret investigation that had identified several order members. The investigation had been led by Brigham Young himself, who had recognized the threat that the order posed to the survival of the Mormon community in Utah. The church's response had been swift and decisive. Known order members had been quietly excommunicated and forced to flee the territory, while others had been reassigned to remote areas where their activities could be more easily monitored. The ritual sites had been sealed or destroyed, and all records of the investigation had been classified to prevent public knowledge of the conspiracy. Jeremiah Blackwood himself had disappeared during the church's crackdown, reportedly fleeing to California, where he had continued to recruit followers for his extremist beliefs. Some reports suggested that he had established new order cells in mining camps and frontier settlements, but these activities had never been officially confirmed. The tablets also contained Blackwood's final message to his followers, written shortly before his disappearance. In this message, he prophesied that the order's practices would eventually be revealed as divinely inspired and would become the ultimate test of faith for all true believers. He instructed his followers to preserve their records and to continue their work in secret until the time came for public revelation of the higher laws. Elder Tanner's team realized that they had uncovered evidence of the most serious crisis in early Mormon history, a secret conspiracy that had operated within the highest levels of the church and had resulted in the ritual murder of dozens of innocent victims. The implications for the church's reputation and the faith of its members were catastrophic. The evidence also raised disturbing questions about what church leaders had known about the order's activities and when they had known it. The tablets suggested that some members of the church hierarchy had been aware of Blackwood's extreme teachings, but had failed to act quickly enough to prevent the development of his murderous conspiracy. Most troubling was the possibility that other order cells had continued to operate after the official crackdown, carrying out additional ritual killings in remote areas where their activities would never be detected. The evidence suggested that the order's influence had been far more extensive than church authorities had realized, with implications that could extend well beyond the Utah territory. As Elder Tanner prepared his final report on the investigation, he faced an impossible choice. The evidence he had uncovered proved that a secret group within the early Mormon church had carried out systematic ritual murders, possibly involving hundreds of victims over nearly a decade. The truth about the Order of Eternal Sacrifice would expose the darkest chapter in Mormon history and could destroy the faith of millions of believers worldwide. But the alternative, concealing the evidence and allowing the victims to remain forgotten, was equally unthinkable. The families of Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, and Ruth Whitmore, along with all the other victims of the Order's rituals, deserved to have their stories told and their deaths acknowledged. The decision would ultimately rest with the Church's highest authorities, but Elder Tanner knew that whatever choice was made would have consequences that would echo through generations of Mormon believers and would shape the Church's relationship with its own history for decades to come. The meeting that would determine the fate of Elder Tanner's investigation took place in the First Presidency's private chambers on November 15, 1920. Present were President Heber J. Grant, his counselors, and the most senior members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. Elder Tanner presented his findings in a 3-hour session that was later described by one participant as the most sobering and troubling presentation in the history of the Church. The evidence was undeniable. The stone chambers, the preserved remains, the detailed tablets, all pointed to a systematic conspiracy that had operated within the early Mormon community and had resulted in the deaths of dozens of innocent victims. The Order of Eternal Sacrifice had been real, and its influence had been far more extensive than anyone had imagined. President Grant's response was measured but decisive. After consulting with his counselors and receiving unanimous agreement from the Quorum of the 12, he made the choice that would define the Church's relationship with this dark chapter of its history. The evidence would be preserved in the Church's most secure archives, accessible only to the highest levels of Church leadership. The victims would be quietly remembered in special memorial services attended only by Church authorities. But the truth about the Order of Eternal Sacrifice would never be revealed to the public. The decision was justified on multiple grounds. Public revelation of the conspiracy would provide ammunition for anti-Mormon critics and could undermine the faith of millions of believers who had dedicated their lives to the Church. The evidence also suggested that the order had been successfully eliminated in the 1850s, meaning that there was no ongoing threat to public safety. Most importantly, the victims and their families had suffered enough. Exposing their stories to public scrutiny and sensationalism would only compound their tragedy. The Mill Creek construction site was quietly relocated to a different area, and the underground chambers were filled with concrete and sealed permanently. The stone tablets and other artifacts were transported to a special vault in Salt Lake City, where they joined other sensitive historical documents that the Church had determined were too dangerous for public knowledge. Elder Tanner was assigned to prepare a comprehensive report that would be preserved for future Church leaders, but he was also sworn to absolute secrecy about his discoveries. The few construction workers and Church officials who had been involved in the investigation were transferred to distant assignments and were required to sign binding agreements never to discuss what they had witnessed. The official explanation for the construction delays at Mill Creek was unexpected geological conditions that required engineering modifications to the building plans. The new meeting house was completed 6 months later on a site 3 miles from the original location, and it served the growing Mill Creek community for decades without any public knowledge of the tragedy that had been discovered and concealed nearby. But the investigation had revealed more than just historical crimes. It had also identified evidence that suggested the Order of Eternal Sacrifice might not have been completely eliminated in the 1850s. Several of the tablets contained references to Western brothers who had carried the Order's teachings to remote mining camps and frontier settlements in California, Nevada, and Colorado. These references suggested that some Order members had escaped the Church's crackdown and had continued their activities in areas beyond Church authority. President Grant quietly authorized a follow-up investigation to determine whether any Order cells remained active in the Western Territories. This investigation, conducted by Church security personnel rather than regular missionaries, uncovered evidence of at least 3 additional ritual sites that had been operated by Order members in the late 1850s and early 1860s. The most disturbing discovery came from a mining camp near Virginia City, Nevada, where investigators found the remains of a ritual chamber that appeared to have been used as recently as 1875. The evidence suggested that some order members had continued their activities for nearly 30 years after the official crackdown, adapting their methods to the more transient populations of mining communities where disappearances were less likely to be investigated. This ongoing threat required immediate action, but it also created additional complications for church authorities. Any investigation of order activities in non-Mormon communities would risk exposing the conspiracy and would require cooperation with federal authorities who might use the information to justify renewed persecution of the Mormon Church. The solution was a secret program that operated for nearly 2 decades, using church resources to identify and eliminate remaining order cells without revealing their existence to public authorities. Church agents worked quietly to locate suspected order members, gather evidence of their activities, and either convince them to cease their operations or arrange for their removal from positions where they could cause further harm. The program was successful in identifying and disrupting at least 6 remaining order cells, but it also revealed the true scope of the original conspiracy. Evidence suggested that the Order of Eternal Sacrifice had operated in at least 15 different locations across the western United States and had been responsible for the deaths of more than 200 victims between 1847 and 1875. The final order cell was eliminated in 1895 when church agents located the aging Jeremiah Blackwood himself, living under an assumed name in a remote mining camp in the Colorado Territory. Blackwood, then in his 70s, had continued to practice his extreme beliefs and had recruited a small group of followers who had carried out at least 12 additional ritual killings over the previous decade. Blackwood's capture and the seizure of his extensive records marked the end of the Order of Eternal Sacrifice as an active threat. But it also provided church authorities with the complete picture of the conspiracy for the first time. The records revealed that the order had been far more organized and influential than anyone had realized, with connections to other extremist religious groups and evidence of influence on early Mormon theology that extended far beyond the Utah Territory. The church's secret campaign against the order was never acknowledged publicly, and the vast majority of Mormon believers remained unaware that such a conspiracy had ever existed within their community. The victims of the order's rituals were remembered only in private ceremonies attended by church authorities, and their names were added to confidential memorial records that honored their sacrifice while concealing the circumstances of their deaths. Elder Tanner completed his service to the church with distinction, never revealing what he had discovered beneath the Mill Creek construction site. He lived to be 93 years old, taking the secret of the Order of Eternal Sacrifice to his grave. His personal papers, sealed after his death in 1963, contained only a brief reference to the most difficult investigation of my life and a prayer that the victims of extreme faith would find peace in the eternal glory they sought through such terrible means. The stone chambers beneath Mill Creek remain sealed today, their contents preserved as evidence of one of the darkest chapters in American religious history. The truth about Ezekiel Whitmore and his 4 wives, along with the hundreds of other victims of the Order of Eternal Sacrifice, continues to rest in the church's most secure archives, known only to a select few who bear the burden of this terrible knowledge. Modern church authorities have occasionally debated whether the time has come to reveal the truth about the order, but each generation has ultimately concluded that the potential harm outweighs any benefit that might come from public disclosure. The victims of the order's extreme faith remain officially listed as early pioneers who departed for destinations unknown, their true fate concealed by more than a century of institutional secrecy. The Mill Creek area today is home to thriving suburban communities, shopping centers, and modern churches that serve thousands of faithful Mormon families. Few residents know that their neighborhood was once the site of ritual chambers where dozens of innocent people died in pursuit of eternal glory. The truth about the winter of 1847-1848, when 4 women vanished without leaving footprints in the snow, remains one of the most carefully guarded secrets in Mormon history. Whether that secret will ever be revealed, or whether it will remain buried forever beneath the weight of institutional protection and the passage of time, is a question that only future generations of church leaders will be able to answer. But the story of Ezekiel Whitmore and his 4 wives serves as a haunting reminder of the terrible consequences that can result when religious faith is twisted into justification for unspeakable acts, and when the pursuit of eternal glory leads to the destruction of innocent lives. The mystery that began with 4 missing women in a remote Utah cabin had revealed a conspiracy that challenged everything the Mormon community believed about their early history. And in the end, the choice between truth and concealment had shaped the church's relationship with its past in ways that continue to influence its leaders and believers more than a century later. Just when we thought we'd uncovered the complete truth about the order of eternal sacrifice, new questions continue to emerge. If this story has given you chills, imagine what other secrets might be buried in America's religious history. Hit that like button if you believe some truths are too terrible to reveal, and subscribe to join our community of brave souls who aren't afraid to explore the darkest mysteries of our past. What do you think? Should the Mormon Church reveal the complete truth about the order, or are some secrets better left buried? Share this video with someone who can handle these dark revelations, and let me know in the comments what other religious mysteries you'd like us to investigate. The truth is out there, waiting for those courageous enough to seek it.